"Grandpa, maybe just wait by the car. I'll come find you after the photos." That was the sentence that changed everything. Not cruel, not shouted, just my grandson's voice, quiet and a little rushed, on the morning of his college graduation, glancing at my worn sport coat and my ordinary shoes the way you glance at something you're hoping nobody else notices too closely. But we'll get there. An hour later, I was standing near a folding table of lemonade cups at the graduate reception, listening to a young professor introduce himself to me with visible, growing disbelief on his face. I remember the exact moment he stopped mid-sentence, looked at the name tag a volunteer had handwritten for me at the check-in table, and said, "Wait, Leonard Voss. Not the Leonard Voss who wrote the original paper on lattice stability we still assign in graduate seminar?" And I remember my grandson standing a few feet away, going very still, realizing all at once that the grandfather he'd asked to wait by the car was apparently someone his own professor had spent years quietly admiring from a distance. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where this really begins. My name is Leonard Voss. I'm 76 years old. I live alone in a modest house at the edge of a quiet town, the same house my wife Ruth and I bought decades ago, back when I was still working long hours in a field most people at our local diner have never heard of. Ruth passed 6 years back. These days I keep mostly to myself, tending a small vegetable garden that never quite thrives the way Ruth's did, and reading more than I probably should for a man my age, out of habits that never fully left me. I drive an old sedan that's outlived two of my neighbor's newer cars, wear the same handful of sport coats I've owned since before my grandson Tyler was born, and generally present, to anyone who doesn't know better, as exactly what I appear to be. An unremarkable retired man of modest means, the kind of grandfather who shows up to things a little early, dressed a little plainly, asking a few too many questions nobody expects him to actually understand the answers to. Here's the thing about me that my grandson grew up mostly not understanding, even though the evidence of it sat quietly in a filing cabinet in my den his entire life. For nearly 3 decades, before retirement, before this quiet house, I worked as a theoretical physicist, publishing research in materials science that, without my fully realizing it at the time, went on to become foundational reading in certain graduate programs decades later. I never sought recognition beyond the narrow circle of colleagues who understood the work. I published under my full name, Leonard Voss, without any particular fanfare, and when I retired 22 years ago, I simply stopped attending conferences, stopped corresponding with the handful of researchers who used to seek my input, and let that entire chapter of my life fold quietly closed, the way certain chapters do when you decide you're finished with them. My son Marcus, Tyler's father, grew up with a general vague understanding that his father did something with science, a phrase that captured almost nothing of what the work actually involved, largely because I never made much effort to explain it in terms that would have meant anything to a boy more interested in baseball than lattice stability equations. That vagueness passed down to Tyler in an even thinner form. To him, I was simply Grandpa, a quiet, somewhat old-fashioned man who showed up to birthdays with modest gifts and never had much to say about himself when asked. Tyler grew up talented and ambitious in a way that, I think, made him increasingly conscious of appearances as he got older. The right university, the right friend group, the right image projected to people whose opinions had started to matter enormously to him by the time he reached his senior year. He'd worked hard, genuinely hard, toward a physics degree himself, something that struck me as a quiet, unremarked-upon irony every time he mentioned a professor's name at a family dinner without any idea that I might recognize it. I noticed, over his college years, a particular pattern developing in how Tyler discussed his family with his university friends and, eventually, with his professors and academic mentors. At a dinner during his sophomore year, when a friend asked what his grandfather used to do, Tyler answered, "Something with computers, I think. A long time ago. Honestly, I've never really asked." A description so vague it wasn't even technically inaccurate, just entirely uninterested in being accurate at all. At a family gathering during his junior year, his girlfriend at the time asked me directly what kind of science I'd worked in. And before I could answer with any real detail, Tyler interjected. Grandpa was like an engineer or something, right? Nothing too exciting, steering the conversation back toward his own recent research assistantship before I had the chance to clarify what something actually meant. There was an afternoon, about a year before his graduation, when I overheard Tyler on the phone with a classmate through the thin wall between the kitchen and the den, describing an upcoming family visit. Yeah, my grandpa's coming. He's sweet but kind of out of it. Doesn't really get what I'm studying. You know how older generations are with this stuff. I stood in that kitchen for a good 10 seconds, holding a mug of coffee, listening to my own grandson describe my supposed incomprehension of a field I'd spent 3 decades contributing meaningfully to, and then I simply finished making my coffee and said nothing. He never knew I'd heard a word. There was a family dinner, maybe 8 months before graduation, where Tyler's mother mentioned to a visiting cousin that I'd always been more of a tinkerer than anything serious. Always had papers everywhere, but never really talked about what they meant. A description that wasn't unkind, exactly, but that flattened 3 decades of genuine scientific contribution into something closer to an eccentric hobby. There was a moment at a holiday gathering, a year before that, when Tyler's roommate, visiting for the weekend, asked me directly what kind of science I'd worked in, and Tyler, sensing an opportunity to redirect attention toward his own recent research assistantship, answered before I could, saying, Grandpa's stuff was pretty old school, way before any of the interesting developments in the field, right, Grandpa? A question that wasn't really a question at all, more a statement dressed up to sound polite. I want to be clear about something. I wasn't angry at Tyler in the way people are angry at strangers. Tyler wasn't cruel by nature. He'd simply built an entire understanding of his grandfather based on the thin, vague information I'd allowed to exist. Information that painted me as pleasantly irrelevant to the field he'd chosen to pursue. Largely because correcting that impression would have required a conversation about my own career that I'd never felt any particular urgency to have. What none of us fully appreciated, including, I suspect, even some of Tyler's own professors, who knew my published work far better than they knew my current quiet existence, was how significant a footnote my early research had become in certain specialized corners of materials science, corners that happened to overlap almost precisely with the graduate concentration Tyler's thesis advisor, a professor named Dr. Aaron Feld, had built his own academic career around. I didn't know any of that mattered yet. What I knew, on the morning of Tyler's graduation, was that I'd driven 3 hours to attend a ceremony my grandson seemed oddly anxious about my presence at, an anxiety I initially attributed to ordinary graduation day nerves rather than anything more specific. Grandpa, maybe just wait by the car, he said that morning, glancing at my sport coat with an expression I recognized, uncomfortably, as embarrassment. There's a whole photo thing with my roommates and their families first, and it might just be easier if... I understand, I said, and I did, in the sense that I recognized exactly what was happening, even if I didn't fully understand why my presence specifically needed managing in that particular way. I waited by the car for nearly 45 minutes, watching other families cluster together for photographs, watching Tyler laugh easily with friends, whose parents, I noticed, all seemed to fit a certain polished, photogenic mold that I, in my worn sport coat, apparently did not. Eventually, Tyler found me and brought me into the ceremony itself, seating me toward the back with a brief, distracted apology I didn't press him on. After the ceremony, at the graduate reception, I found myself standing near a folding table of lemonade cups, mostly alone, while Tyler circulated among friends and faculty in a manner that suggested considerable practice at exactly this kind of professional networking. I want to describe what happened next exactly as it occurred, because it's the moment everything changed, and it happened without me saying a single word to start it. A young professor, introducing himself around the reception with the easy warmth of someone accustomed to being liked by students, approached the check-in table near where I was standing, glanced at the handwritten name tags still laid out for latecomers, and stopped abruptly at one that read simply, Leonard Voss. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to me directly. "Is this your name tag? Leonard Voss?" "That's right," I said, Not the Leonard Voss who published the original paper on lattice stability under strain conditions? The one we still assign in my graduate seminar as foundational reading? I want to tell you honestly what happened in me in that moment, because I think it matters. Something that had been quiet and folded away for over 2 decades opened its eyes, not with pride exactly, but with a kind of surprised, unfamiliar warmth, the specific feeling of being recognized for something you'd genuinely forgotten anyone still remembered. That would be me, I said, though it's been a long time since anyone brought it up at a family function. Dr. Voss, he said, and I noticed the shift immediately, the sudden formality replacing his earlier casual warmth. I need to shake your hand properly. I built half my dissertation on frameworks you established. I had no idea you were even still. He paused, apparently searching for a polite way to say alive, and settled instead on active in attending events like this. Tyler, who had drifted back toward us mid-conversation, went very still, his expression shifting rapidly from mild confusion to something closer to dawning alarm. "Wait," Tyler said. "Dr. Feld, this is my grandfather." "Your grandfather," Dr. Feld repeated, looking between us with an expression of genuine astonishment. "Tyler, you've been in my graduate seminar for 2 years. You've read this man's paper. You've cited this man's paper, if I recall your last assignment correctly. And you never once mentioned he was your own grandfather?" "I didn't. I mean, I knew Grandpa did science, but I never—" Tyler stopped, apparently hearing how thin his own explanation sounded even as he offered it. "You never asked," I said quietly, not unkindly, but honestly. "It's all right, Tyler. Most families don't sit around discussing lattice stability at Thanksgiving." Dr. Feld, to his credit, seemed to sense the delicate territory he'd stumbled into, though his enthusiasm remained difficult to fully contain. "Dr. Voss, I would be enormously grateful for even 20 minutes of your time at some point, if you'd be willing. Your work fundamentally shaped how an entire generation of us approached the field." The reception continued around us with a different kind of attention following our small group for the rest of the afternoon. Not admiration exactly directed at me from strangers, but a recalibrated respect that Tyler, in particular, seemed to find almost as uncomfortable as his earlier embarrassment had apparently been comfortable. Tyler drove me back to my car that evening instead of letting me walk the short distance alone, and we sat in his car for a long while before either of us spoke. "I told you to wait by the car this morning," he said finally, his voice low, "because I didn't want my roommates seeing you in that coat next to their parents in their nice suits. I feel like an idiot saying that out loud." "You made an assumption about what mattered and acted on it," I said. "That's not idiocy, Tyler. It's just what happens when nobody bothers to ask the real question, and the person who could answer it doesn't feel like volunteering it unprompted." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. "Any of it, all these years." "Because I didn't want you growing up measuring your own path in physics against your grandfather's old work," I said. "I wanted you to choose the field because you loved it, not because you felt some obligation to live up to a name you barely understood the weight of. Maybe that was the wrong call. I don't know anymore, but it came from wanting you proud of your own choices, not shadowed by mine." "Dr. Feld looked at you like you were somebody important," Tyler said. "I've spent 2 years in his seminar. I've never seen him look at anyone like that." "I was somebody important, in a very narrow, specific way, to a very narrow, specific group of people, a long time ago," I said. "It's not the same as being important in the way you seem to think matters at parties with your roommates' families." "Isn't it, though?" he asked. "I spent this whole morning worried about how you'd look standing next to people in expensive suits. And it turns out the most impressive person at that entire reception was standing right next to me the whole time, and I'd never once bothered to find out." "I wasn't the most impressive person there," I said. "I was simply someone whose old work happened to matter to one particular professor in the room." "That's a narrower thing than you're making it out to be, and I'd rather you understand the actual size of it than build a new, equally inflated story to replace the small one you had before." "Can I ask you something honestly?" Tyler said. "Did it bother you, waiting by the car this morning?" I considered the question for a moment before answering. "A little," I said. Not because I needed to be at those photographs, because I understood, watching you ask me to wait, exactly what you were embarrassed of. And it's an odd thing, at my age, to still feel that particular kind of sting from someone you love. The weeks that followed were their own kind of complicated. There's a version of this story where the reception is the climax, and everything after is a footnote, but that's not how these things actually resolve, and I want to be honest about that. Real resolution is slow. It's Tyler asking, over several visits home, careful, genuine questions about my actual research, questions that required sitting with technical answers that didn't always resolve neatly into simple, impressive stories. It's Dr. Feld inviting me to guest lecture in his graduate seminar, an invitation I accepted carefully, on my own terms, sharing only as much as felt useful to a room of students who'd read my old paper without ever expecting to meet its author. There was an afternoon, about a month after graduation, when Tyler asked if he could see my old research notebooks, the actual working drafts rather than the polished, published paper. I showed him some of it, enough for him to understand the shape of the work without needing every technical detail explained at once. He sat with the old notebooks for a long time, quiet in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "Why didn't you keep publishing?" he asked. "After you retired?" "Because your grandmother needed more of my attention than the field did, toward the end," I said. And because I'd said what I had to say, and didn't feel any particular urgency to keep saying it louder just to remain visible. Some people need the field to keep validating them. I found I didn't, once I'd made my contribution. Dr. Feld mentioned you turned down 2 invitations to speak at major conferences after Grandma got sick, Tyler said. He found old correspondence records in the department archive. He seemed almost as impressed by that as by the actual research. Your grandmother didn't need a husband chasing recognition at conferences while she was frightened and unwell, I said. That wasn't a difficult choice, Tyler, whatever it might look like from the outside now. I watched my grandson in those weeks do something I hadn't fully seen him do before. I watched him stop editing his own family history down to something more comfortable for other people's approval. At a departmental gathering the following semester, when a classmate asked, in passing, whether he was related to that Voss, Tyler answered, without hesitation, "He's my grandfather." I spent most of my life not knowing what that actually meant, because I never asked the right questions. I'm not making that mistake again. I didn't feel triumphant when the whole situation finally settled. I want to be honest about that too. I felt tired, the particular tired that comes after finally setting down a quiet chapter of your life you'd assumed nobody would ever ask about again. I thought about Ruth a great deal in those weeks. What she would have said, watching our grandson finally ask the hard, curious questions neither of us had pushed him toward. Watching Dr. Feld's genuine enthusiasm remind me, briefly, of a version of myself I'd mostly let go quiet. I think Ruth would have been proudest not of the reception itself, but of the afternoon with the old notebooks that followed it. It's been almost a year now. Tyler is in his first year of graduate school himself, in the very department where Dr. Feld teaches, and he calls most weeks now, sometimes with genuine questions about physics, sometimes just to talk, which is its own kind of gift, after years of a relationship that had grown thinner than either of us fully noticed at the time. Dr. Feld and I correspond occasionally now, an unexpected friendship born out of an accidental reception encounter neither of us anticipated. He asked me, a few months ago, whether I'd consider co-authoring a retrospective paper on the original research, updated with 3 decades of subsequent developments I'd followed quietly from a distance without ever contributing to directly. I'm still considering it. Last month, Tyler visited and asked, unprompted, if he could go through my old filing cabinet properly, not out of urgent curiosity but out of genuine interest in knowing his grandfather more completely. He sat on the floor of my den with old papers spread around him for a long time. "Why'd you let me think you were just Grandpa does something with computers for my entire life?" he asked. "Because I didn't want you to know me as a physicist first," I said. "I wanted you to know me as your grandfather. I still do." The physicist did his work quietly and stepped back from it. The grandfather was for making sure you never felt pressure to live inside someone else's shadow. He looked at the old papers a long moment, then up at me. "You could have told me sooner," he said. "Not for your sake, for mine. I spent years being quietly embarrassed by an incomplete picture of you that I never bothered to actually investigate. I think about that often now. How much of the people we love we simply never fully see, not because they're hiding on purpose, but because we've already decided, quietly and long ago, what shape we expect them to take, and because asking real questions about someone requires a curiosity we don't always think to extend to the people closest to us." Tyler looked at me for years and saw an unremarkable, old-fashioned grandfather with nothing particularly relevant to his own ambitions. He wasn't entirely wrong that I preferred a quiet, unremarkable life. He was wrong about nearly everything else. Some evenings now, I sit in my garden, which still doesn't grow quite as well as Ruth's did, and I think about how strange the shape of a life turns out to be. I spent nearly 3 decades being a man very few people outside a narrow professional circle fully understood, not because I hid it out of shame, but because I never once thought it needed announcing at family gatherings where it simply wasn't relevant. Ruth used to say, "I carried my work the way some men carry a hobby, seriously, but without needing anyone else to be impressed by it." I think she understood the shape of that quiet better than I ever articulated it myself. I think, too, about how easily a family's understanding of someone can settle into whatever shape requires the least explanation. Tyler didn't invent the idea that I was unremarkable out of malice. He simply inherited a vague, thin description from his own father, who inherited it from years of my own quiet disinterest in correcting the record, and none of us thought to question it until an accidental introduction at a graduation reception made the gap impossible to ignore any longer. I don't regret the years of staying vague about my actual research. I want to say that plainly, because I know some people hearing this will wonder why I let my own grandson grow up with such an incomplete picture. I'd do it again. Every vague answer at a family dinner, every year Tyler grew up thinking of me as simply an old man who did something with computers. I would trade all of it again for a grandson who chose physics because he genuinely loved it, rather than because he felt some inherited obligation to a grandfather's old reputation. That's what a grandfather owes his grandson, the way I see it. Not a legacy to perform, a field to love on his own terms. What I do regret, if I'm honest, is not finding a gentler way to let him know the actual shape of my career, before an accidental encounter at his own graduation forced the reveal in front of his professor and his own visible embarrassment about my worn sport coat. I thought quiet vagueness was a form of humility. What I've learned, watching my grandson finally ask real questions and correct the record himself among his own classmates, is that some truths deserve a calmer, more deliberate unveiling than the one accident handed us that afternoon. Tyler mistook my quiet life for an unremarkable one, because I let him. I don't blame him for that. I built that impression myself, year by careful year, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. But I'm glad, in the end, that the truth finally had its say, however accidentally it arrived. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a small garden in the evening, once the light has gone soft and the only sound left is whatever the crickets have decided to contribute. I sit in that quiet most nights now, and I don't feel any different for Dr. Feld's enthusiastic recognition, or for Tyler's newfound curiosity about a career I'd mostly let go quiet myself. If anything, I feel more at peace than I have in years, not because anyone finally understood the weight of that old research, but because my grandson finally understands the shape of his own grandfather a little more completely than he did before, and that understanding didn't require a single moment of performance from either of us. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from all this, it's this. The quietest person at your family gathering, the one in the worn coat you might ask to wait by the car, may be carrying a history far more significant than you've ever bothered to ask about. Don't mistake someone's plainness for the entirety of what they've contributed. And don't wait for a stranger to recognize someone's worth before you finally ask the people you love the real questions about who they actually are. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone in your life who's underestimated the quiet ones. Somebody out there needs to hear it today.